She was 27 years old, with gray-blue eyes that had seen too much death and hands that still trembled every time she heard a man raise his voice. Charlotte Monroe worked the graveyard shift at a rundown bar on Chicago's South Side, surviving on lousy tips and cold coffee, raising her 14-year-old sister in a cramped apartment with 3 locks on the door because the man who'd put scars on her ribs was still out there hunting for her. She'd learned long ago that hoping for a better life was just another way to get your heart broken, so she kept her head down, her mouth shut, and counted the days until she could afford to run again. Then he walked in. Salvatore Benedetti, 36 years old, the most feared crime boss in the Midwest, a man who'd clawed his way up from nothing after being abandoned by a father who never acknowledged his existence until death came knocking. He wore a suit that cost more than she'd make in a year, and his eyes were so dark they seemed to swallow the light. Everyone in that bar knew to look away when he entered. Everyone except her, because Charlotte Monroe had stopped being afraid of monsters the day she married one. She didn't know that meeting his gaze would change everything, that the most dangerous man in Chicago would become obsessed with the broken waitress who didn't flinch, or that his family's darkest secret was tied to the father she'd watched die when she was just 12 years old. If you're loving this story, smash that like button and share it with a friend who can't resist a dark romance. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's find out if 2 people with blood on their pasts can build something worth living for. Salvatore Benedetti chose the table in the farthest corner of the bar, where he could observe the entire room, while no one could approach him from behind. Tony Caruso and Bruno Santini stood a few steps away, their eyes sweeping over every face in the bar like hawks on the hunt. Charlotte held her tray of drinks and walked toward their table with the weary gait of someone who had spent 12 hours standing on aching feet. She didn't know who the man in front of her was. Didn't know that the name Benedetti could make the entire city of Chicago tremble, and perhaps it was that very ignorance that saved her from becoming a flatterer like everyone else. She stopped at the table, pulled a small notebook from her apron pocket, and asked in an even, emotionless voice what they would like to order. Sal looked up at her, and in that moment his dark eyes paused on her wrist as she raised her hand to write. The bruise had faded to a yellow-green shade, the imprint of fingers that had once squeezed hard enough to nearly crush bone. And although Charlotte had tried to tug her sleeve down to hide it, it still showed when she moved. He said nothing about the bruise, simply ordered a whiskey neat, and continued to watch her with an expression Charlotte couldn't read. She turned away to fetch the drink, aware of his gaze burning into her back, but she didn't look over her shoulder, didn't tremble, didn't show the fear other girls usually did when facing powerful men. She had learned long ago how to hide fear, from nights when Frank came home drunk, and she had to pretend to be asleep to avoid becoming the target of his senseless rage. When Charlotte returned with the whiskey, she set it on the table neatly and professionally. Not a drop spilled, not a single unnecessary gesture. Sal took a small sip, his eyes never leaving her, then asked in a low, unhurried voice how long she had worked there. Charlotte answered briefly that it had been 8 months, no more, no less, making no effort to chat or impress him. Sal tilted his head slightly, a thin smile appearing on his lips as he realized she wasn't trying to please him the way everyone else did whenever he entered a room. He asked if she liked the job, and Charlotte met his eyes for the first time since the conversation began, her gray-blue gaze cold as steel as she replied that no one liked working until 4 a.m. serving drunk people, but bills don't pay themselves. Tony frowned slightly at the blunt answer, but Sal laughed, a short, dry sound as if he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone speak to him so directly. When Charlotte brought the check at the end of the night, she saw a $1,000 bill lying on the table, 10 times the price of the whiskey, and more than all the tips she made in an entire month. She stood there for a moment, looking at the money, then looked up at Sal as he prepared to leave. She picked up the bill and walked over to him, handed it back, and said without hesitation that she didn't accept pity money from anyone. Sal stopped and turned to her, open surprise on his face. He said it wasn't pity, but Charlotte shook her head and replied that a man doesn't leave $1,000 for a single glass of whiskey unless it's pity, or he wants something, and she had nothing to give. She pressed the bill into his hand, turned, and walked away without waiting for a response. Tony stepped beside Sal as they headed for the car, his face full of questions as he asked why the boss would care about an ordinary waitress in a rundown bar like that. Sal didn't answer right away. He looked through the window into the bar, where Charlotte was wiping down tables, her shoulders tired but her back still straight. Then he said thoughtfully that she wasn't afraid of him, and that was the rarest thing he had encountered in 20 years of living in this world. Tony still didn't understand, But he had followed Sal long enough to know that when the boss set his eyes on someone, nothing could change that. And the waitress with gray-blue eyes had no idea that her life was about to change forever from that night on. Charlotte pushed open the door of the apartment in the Pilsen neighborhood at 4 a.m, her legs heavy as if weighted with lead after the endless shift. The apartment had only one tiny bedroom, walls stained with damp mold, and an old wooden floor that creaked beneath every step. But it was the safest place she could find with the little money she earned from the bar. Lucy was asleep on the worn sofa in the corner of the room, brown hair spread across the pillow, one hand still resting on an open biology textbook. Charlotte stood silently for a moment, her heart tightening at the sight of a 14-year-old child sleeping on a sofa because the apartment didn't have enough space for 2 separate beds. She gently picked up the book and set it aside, pulled the blanket over Lucy's shoulders, and bent down to kiss her forehead. This was why she worked every night, why she endured prying eyes and drunken hands, why she kept getting up every day even when life felt so heavy she wanted to collapse. She walked to the door and checked the 3 locks as she did every night, a habit that had settled into her bones since she fled from Frank 8 months earlier. The first lock was a standard one. The second was a chain bolt. The third was a metal bar she had bought herself from a hardware store and installed. 3 locks for 3 layers of protection. Yet deep down, Charlotte knew that if Frank truly found her, no lock would stop him. She sat by the window and looked out at the empty street under the pale yellow glow of streetlights, and memories of the last night with Frank flooded back like a nightmare that refused to let go. That night he came home drunk, eyes bloodshot and breath thick with alcohol, and when Charlotte accidentally knocked over a glass of water on the table, he completely lost control. He punched her to the floor, kicked her in the stomach, then dragged her up and threw her against the wall. The sound of her ribs cracking still echoed in her ears every night. The scar nearly 10 centimeters long was still there on her left rib cage, a permanent reminder of the 8 years of hell she had survived. That night, she waited until he passed out, gathered whatever she could carry, lifted Lucy from her sleep into the cold night, and ran from that house forever. Charlotte shuddered and pulled herself back from the memory, realizing dawn had begun to break and she still hadn't slept. She went into the bathroom to wash her face, looked at her pale reflection with deep shadows under her eyes, and wondered how much longer her body could endure this life. When she stepped out, the old phone on the table vibrated with a message alert. Charlotte picked it up, and her blood turned cold as she read the words from an unknown number on the screen. Just a few words, but enough to shove her into the abyss of fear, saying, "I know where you are now, and I'm coming to take you home." She recognized it instantly. It was Frank. He had found her after 8 months of hiding. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone, her heart pounding wildly in her chest as her breathing turned shallow and rushed. Her first instinct was to wake Lucy, pack their things, and run immediately like she had 8 months ago. But then she looked at her sister sleeping peacefully on the sofa and remembered that Lucy had only just settled into her new school a few weeks earlier, had just made her first friends, had just begun to smile again after so many months of living in fear. She couldn't make her sister run again, couldn't rip a child out of a life that had only just begun to feel stable because of her own fear. Charlotte deleted the message, set the phone down, and made the decision to stay, at least until she found a way to protect them both, even as she knew the shadow of the past was drawing closer with every passing moment. In the days that followed, Salvatore Benedetti appeared at the bar almost every night, always sitting at the same table in the farthest corner, always ordering the same whiskey neat, and always watching Charlotte with those deep black eyes whose meaning she couldn't understand. She tried to ignore his presence, serving his table with the same cool professional detachment she used for every other customer, saying nothing beyond what the job required. Yet she couldn't help noticing that whenever he was there, no customer dared stare at her for too long, no drunken hand dared reach for her, as if his presence created an invisible shield that protected her from every form of harassment. One night after her shift, Patty Rossi pulled Charlotte into a shadowed corner behind the bar, her brown eyes wide with a mix of excitement and fear as she whispered whether Charlotte knew who that man was. Charlotte shook her head, and Patty seemed unable to believe her coworker's innocence, as she trembled and said that it was Salvatore Benedetti, the most notorious mafia boss in the Midwest, a man whose name alone was enough to make the entire city of Chicago bow its head. Patty went on to say that Benedetti controlled most of the underground operations, from Chicago to Gary, from smuggling to loan sharking to darker things no one dared speak aloud, that anyone who opposed him vanished without a trace, that even the police didn't dare touch him. Charlotte felt the blood in her veins slow as she listened, and she knew instantly that she had to stay away from this man at all costs. She had lived with a monster for 8 years, and she knew better than anyone that powerful men were the most dangerous kind, always wanting to possess and control, and when they weren't satisfied, they destroyed. From that night on, Charlotte began trying to avoid Sal, asking Patty to serve his table whenever possible, lowering her head and hurrying past when she was forced to walk near him. Still, she could feel his gaze following her every step, and it left her both frightened and stirred by a strange sensation she didn't dare name. The real trouble began one night when Charlotte finished her shift at 3 in the morning and walked home as usual. She was halfway there when she realized footsteps were trailing behind her, not too close and not too far, always keeping the same distance as if stalking prey. Her heart raced as she thought of Frank, of the threatening message days earlier, and she began to walk faster. The shadow behind her sped up as well. Charlotte turned into a narrow alley, running as hard as she could on her aching legs. And just as she thought she was about to be caught, the headlights of a black SUV suddenly swept through the alley. She heard tires screech, a curse from the man following her, and footsteps retreating into the distance. The black SUV paused for a moment, as if making sure the man was gone, then slowly drove away without anyone stepping out. Charlotte stood there gasping for breath, her heart pounding as if it would burst from her chest, and she realized the SUV looked exactly like the one Sal and his men always used. The following night at the bar, a large, drunken customer staggered up to Charlotte as she carried a tray of drinks, grabbed her arm, and yanked her toward him with a hungry grin. Slurring his words, he said that a pretty girl like her shouldn't be working in a place like this, that he could give her a better life if she behaved herself. Charlotte tried to pull free, but he was too strong, his nails digging into her skin as that familiar terror rose in her throat. Then everything happened in an instant. Bruno Santini appeared as if from nowhere, seized the drunk by the collar, and hurled him to the floor like a doll. Before the man could get up, Bruno planted a foot on his chest and leaned down, his voice cold as ice, as he said that if the man ever touched her again, he would lose his arm. The drunk stammered apologies and crawled out of the bar at an unbelievable speed. Charlotte stood there trembling, watching Bruno return to his place beside Sal as if nothing had happened. And when she looked toward the far corner table, Sal's dark eyes were fixed on her with an expression that wasn't pity and wasn't desire, but something deeper she couldn't define. She understood then that the SUV the night before and Bruno's intervention tonight were all because of him. Salvatore Benedetti was protecting her without asking for anything in return, and that confused her more than any threat ever had. At the bar across the room, Patty was polishing glasses and observing everything with narrowed, calculating eyes, memorizing every small detail of the boss's special attention toward her ordinary coworker, and in her mind, plans had already begun to form that Charlotte couldn't possibly imagine. That fateful night was the only night in the past 2 weeks when Salvatore Benedetti didn't appear at the bar, and Charlotte had no idea that his absence would nearly cost her her life. She was carrying a tray of drinks toward a table near the entrance when the door flew open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. That face, that walk, that crazed look that had haunted her for 8 years, and that 8 months of running, still hadn't been enough to erase the terror that seized her every time she saw him. Frank Hollis stood there in rumpled clothes, unshaven, with the bloodshot eyes of an alcoholic, yet his body was still solid and dangerous as ever. He had been a Chicago Police Department officer for 12 years before being fired for excessive violence against suspects, and the skills he learned on the job had turned him into the perfect nightmare for any woman foolish enough to love him. Charlotte dropped the tray, the sound of shattering glasses ringing across the floor, but she heard nothing except her own heart pounding wildly in her chest. She turned to run toward the back of the bar, but Frank was faster, cutting across the room with the speed of a predator and grabbing her arm before she could take 2 more steps. He dragged her into a dark corner near the restrooms, shoved her against the wall, and blocked every escape with his massive frame. Charlotte tried to scream, but he clamped a rough hand over her mouth, his breath reeking of alcohol as he leaned close to her ear and whispered in a voice cold as ice that if she made a sound, he would go to Lucy's school and teach the girl what hell really was. Hearing her sister's name from his mouth froze Charlotte in place, and the fear for herself was nothing compared to the fear for Lucy, the innocent child she had sworn to protect at any cost. Frank sneered when he saw her surrender in her eyes and told her he had been watching her for 2 weeks, that he knew where she lived, knew which school Lucy attended, knew what time she went to work and what time she came home. He said she belonged to him, that she would always belong to him, and if she didn't come back to him willingly that very night, he would make sure Lucy paid for her stubbornness. Charlotte felt tears slide down her cheeks, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out, refusing to let him see her weakness even as her heart shattered into pieces. She tried to push him away, but he was too strong, his fingers crushing her wrist, until she could feel bone grinding beneath his grip. Patty stood behind the bar watching everything and did nothing, merely polishing a glass as if nothing were happening, her cold eyes observing without the slightest intention of intervening. Charlotte thought this was the end, that she would be forced back into hell or watch her sister be hurt, and she didn't know which choice was more unbearable. Then, at that exact moment, the bar door opened once more, and the air in the room froze as if all the oxygen had been sucked away. Salvatore Benedetti walked in with Tony Caruso and Bruno Santini behind him, his black suit immaculate without a single crease, his gaze sweeping the room with familiar detachment. But when that gaze landed on the dark corner where Frank was pinning Charlotte to the wall, something in those deep black eyes changed completely. Charlotte saw fury ignite in Sal's eyes, cold and lethal, like the scythe of death itself. And she knew that blood would be spilled tonight. Frank turned to face the newcomer, and the color drained from his face as he realized who stood before him, his hand still gripping Charlotte's wrist, but his body beginning to tremble uncontrollably. The entire bar fell silent, no one daring to breathe too loudly, everyone waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Salvatore Benedetti walked toward the dark corner where Frank was pinning Charlotte against the wall, each step slow and deliberate, like a panther closing in on its prey. Tony and Bruno shifted to either side, blocking every possible escape, and the entire bar seemed to hold its breath as it waited for the storm about to break. When Sal stopped less than 2 steps away from Frank, he didn't shout, and he didn't bark threats like an ordinary thug. He simply looked straight into Frank's eyes and said in a low, even voice that was chilling in its calm that he should take his hand off her or lose the entire arm. Just one sentence. Nothing more, nothing less. Yet the weight of it made the air in the bar thicken until it felt as though it could be cut with a knife. Frank Hollis had been a police officer for 12 years, had faced every kind of violent criminal, had always believed he was the strongest man in any room he entered, but standing in front of Salvatore Benedetti, all that arrogance dissolved like mist under the sun. He knew that name. Everyone in Chicago's criminal world did, and he also knew that those who dared challenge Benedetti rarely lived long enough to regret it. Frank's face drained of color by the second, his grip on Charlotte's wrist slowly loosening as if he were holding a burning coal, and when he stumbled back a step, his legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand. He muttered something that sounded like an apology, but Sal didn't bother to listen. He merely tilted his head slightly toward the door, and Frank understood the message immediately. He turned and fled the bar at the speed of a man running from death itself, never looking back once, his figure swallowed by the night as if he had never been there at all. Charlotte sagged against the wall, her legs trembling so violently she wasn't sure how much longer she could remain standing, and then everything she had been holding back for so many years finally broke free. She cried, not with loud sobs, but with silent tears sliding down her cheeks, her shoulders shaking in waves, and her breath coming in broken gasps, as if she were struggling not to collapse entirely. It was the first time in years she had cried in front of anyone. She had learned to swallow her tears on nights when Frank beat her for daring to cry and disturb him. But tonight she couldn't contain it anymore. Sal stood there watching her, the darkness in his eyes gone, replaced by something else, something soft and painful, as if he were seeing himself reflected in her. He didn't step forward to hold her, and he didn't touch her, not even with a finger, understanding that after what she had just endured, the last thing she needed was another man's touch. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his suit jacket, took out a pristine white handkerchief, and extended it toward her, keeping enough distance that she could refuse if she wanted. Charlotte looked at the handkerchief for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took it, wiping her tears with clumsy movements as she tried to steady her breathing. When she had calmed a little, Sal finally spoke, his voice low and gentler than before, telling her that she couldn't keep working here because the man would come back, and next time he might not be there to stop him. He offered her a position at his restaurant, Benedetti's, in the River North area, a floor manager role with a salary 5 times what she was earning now, more reasonable hours, and most importantly, protection around the clock. Charlotte shook her head almost immediately, her voice hoarse from crying as she said she didn't want to owe anyone anything, that she had taken care of herself and her sister for 8 months, and she didn't need anyone's pity. Sal didn't look irritated or disappointed. He simply nodded as if he had expected that answer, then added one sentence that made Charlotte freeze. He said he knew about Lucy, knew which school the girl attended and where they lived, and he also knew that Frank wouldn't give up so easily, because men like him never accepted losing what they considered their own. He asked whether Charlotte truly wanted to risk her sister's safety for the sake of her own pride. Hearing Lucy's name felt like a punch to the stomach. The image of her innocent sister asleep on the old sofa, books scattered around her, filled Charlotte's mind, and she knew Sal was right. She couldn't protect Lucy on her own. Not now that Frank knew where they lived. Not when he could appear at any moment, and she had nothing but 3 old locks between them and danger. She closed her eyes for a long time, swallowed all the pride and self-respect she had fought so hard to preserve, then opened them and looked straight at Sal. She said yes, she would take the job, but she wanted it made clear that this was strictly a professional arrangement, and that she wouldn't owe him anything beyond doing her work well. Sal nodded in agreement, without a single comment, but in his deep black eyes, a brief glint of light flickered that Charlotte didn't notice. The light of a man who had finally found something he hadn't known he had been searching for all these years. Benedetti's restaurant was located in the heart of River North, one of the most luxurious and expensive districts in Chicago, where the cost of a single month's rent alone would have been enough for Charlotte to pay for her small apartment in Pilsen for 10 years. Charlotte stood in front of the building on the morning of her first day of work, lifting her gaze to the gleaming facade of glass and polished black marble, and she felt as though she had stepped into a world completely different from anything she had ever known. The interior of the restaurant was even more overwhelming, with soaring ceilings crowned by sparkling crystal chandeliers, oak floors polished to a mirror-like shine, deep red velvet chairs and tables, and walls adorned with artwork that Charlotte suspected each cost more than everything she owned combined. A middle-aged woman named Margaret led her through the space and explained her duties, her voice polite but edged with cool reserve as her eyes took in Charlotte's simple clothing. Charlotte was assigned the position of floor manager, responsible for coordinating service staff and ensuring everything ran smoothly during the evening shift, a role that Margaret noted usually required at least 3 years before anyone was even considered. Charlotte understood immediately that this wasn't a job she had earned through experience or merit. It was Salvatore Benedetti's way of keeping her close, placing her where he could watch over and protect her, without needing to explain himself to anyone. She didn't know whether to feel grateful or angry about that. The other employees watched her with a range of expressions, some openly curious about who she was to receive such special treatment, some resentful that an unknown girl from the South Side had suddenly leapt into a position they had worked their entire lives to reach, and some whispered behind her back, speculating about the nature of her relationship with the owner. Charlotte tried to ignore it all and focus on her work, learning quickly and working twice as hard as everyone else to prove she deserved to be there, even though she knew it probably wouldn't change how they saw her. The first day passed relatively smoothly, until night fell, and Charlotte began to notice strange details. There was a door at the back of the restaurant that led to a separate corridor, and throughout the evening she saw men in expensive suits quietly passing through it, their expressions tense and severe. They weren't ordinary customers. Charlotte could tell from the way they moved, from how their eyes swept the room before entering, from the subtle bulges beneath their jackets that she knew were guns. Sal's office was at the end of that corridor, and sometimes she could hear low voices drifting out from behind the closed door, not clear enough to make out words, but unmistakably not the sounds of normal business meetings. She understood then that this elegant restaurant was only a facade, a legitimate front for underground operations she didn't want to know about and shouldn't know about. At the end of her shift, as Charlotte stood alone at the bar reviewing the books, Tony Caruso appeared beside her without warning, like a ghost. He was Sal's right-hand man, a 40-year-old with a hardened face and eyes sharp as blades, and Charlotte had never heard him speak more than a few sentences at a time. Tony stood next to her in silence for a moment, then spoke in a low, even tone that sounded like a death sentence being read aloud, telling her that she was smart, and that he hoped she was smart enough to understand a few basic rules about working there. He said there would be things she would see, things she would hear, things she would wonder about, but the single rule for surviving in this place was, don't look, don't listen, don't ask. Tony held Charlotte's gaze as he said the last words, his eyes neither threatening nor friendly, simply delivering a truth she needed to carve into her bones if she wanted to continue existing in this world. Charlotte nodded to show she understood, and Tony disappeared back into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. That night, when Charlotte returned to the apartment in Pilsen, She lay on her bed staring at the ceiling and wondered what kind of monster's lair she had stepped into. But when she thought of Lucy sleeping peacefully in the next room, she knew she had no choice but to keep walking this path, no matter where it might lead. 2 weeks of working at Benedetti's passed, and Charlotte began to adjust to her new rhythm of life, to shifts that ended at midnight instead of 4 in the morning, to a salary that meant she no longer had to count every coin at the grocery store, to a strange sense of safety she hadn't known in 8 years. But all of that fragile peace shattered one afternoon when Lucy came home glowing with excitement and announced that she had just been transferred to a wonderful new school. At first, Charlotte didn't understand what her sister was talking about until Lucy showed her the new uniform with the Francis Parker School logo embroidered on the chest, and Charlotte felt her heart drop into her stomach as she realized what it meant. Francis Parker was one of the most prestigious and expensive private schools in Chicago, where the children of millionaires and billionaires studied, where a single year of tuition could support her entire family for 3 years. Charlotte asked who had arranged it, and her innocent sister replied that a man had come to the old school to speak with the principal, and everything had been settled within a day. Charlotte didn't need to think long to know who that man was. That night she entered Benedetti's with anger boiling inside her, walked straight to Sal's office without asking permission or announcing herself, pushed the door open, and slammed it shut behind her. Sal was seated behind his desk with a stack of papers in front of him. He looked up at her with brief surprise before his familiar detachment returned. Charlotte didn't wait for him to speak. Her voice trembled with fury as she demanded who he thought he was to interfere in her sister's life, without asking her first. She said she had made it clear from the beginning that this was a purely professional arrangement, that she didn't want to owe him anything, yet he had unilaterally moved Lucy to a school she could never afford. Sal set his pen down and looked at her with expressionless dark eyes, replying in his usual cold tone that it wasn't her concern because he had taken care of everything, and she didn't have to pay a single dollar. Charlotte nearly shouted that that was exactly the problem, that she didn't want help she couldn't repay, that she didn't want Lucy growing up believing she could receive everything from others without effort. She said she had taken care of herself and her sister all her life, and she didn't need anyone's pity. Sal was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her with something Charlotte couldn't decipher. Then he stood and stepped closer. His voice remained cool, but there was something different in his eyes, something deep and painful she had never seen before. He said no child deserved to be punished for the mistakes of adults, that Lucy wasn't at fault for being born into poverty, and she deserved the best chance to grow. Then he added, almost in a whisper, that he knew exactly what that felt like, the feeling of being a child stripped of every opportunity because of adult decisions beyond their control. The words stopped Charlotte cold. Her anger ebbed as she saw something in Sal's dark eyes, a small crack in the steel wall he had built around himself, a fleeting vulnerability he hadn't meant to reveal. She wanted to ask what he meant, but Sal had already turned away toward the window, ending the conversation without another word. Charlotte left the office with more questions than answers, and that night she couldn't stop thinking about the look in Sal's eyes when he let his pain show. Near midnight, as she was preparing to leave, Charlotte passed the corridor leading to Sal's office and heard voices drifting through the partially closed door. She knew she shouldn't stop. Tony had warned her clearly, "Don't look, don't listen, don't ask." But when she heard an unfamiliar voice mention the name Don Carmine Benedetti, her feet felt nailed to the floor. The man speaking with Sal was Richard Stone, the Benedetti family's lawyer, and he was reporting that Don Carmine Benedetti was dying of late-stage cancer at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The old man had only weeks, or at most a few months, left to live, and he had one final request, to see his son. Charlotte heard Sal's bitter scoff echo through the office, a sound filled with resentment and contempt. In a voice cold as ice, he said Don Carmine had had 36 years to be a father, and had chosen to ignore Sal's existence the entire time. So now that death was knocking, he had no right to ask anything of him. He said the man could die alone, just as Sal's mother had died alone in a miserable South Side apartment, while Don Carmine lived in a mansion and pretended she never existed. Charlotte stood in the darkness, her heart aching at his words, and she began to understand that Salvatore Benedetti wasn't just a ruthless mafia boss, but also an abandoned child carrying wounds that had never healed. Charlotte was about to turn away when the office door suddenly swung open, and light spilled out into the hallway, illuminating where she stood. Sal was framed in the doorway, his dark eyes looking down at her with an expression she couldn't read, and Charlotte felt the blood in her veins turn to ice as she realized she had been caught listening. She opened her mouth to explain, but no words came out. She stood there like a child caught doing something forbidden, waiting for the anger she was certain would come. Tony had warned her clearly about the rules in this place, and she had broken them outright. She didn't know what the punishment was for eavesdropping on a mafia boss's secrets, but she was certain it wouldn't be gentle. Yet Sal didn't shout, didn't threaten her, didn't call anyone in to deal with her the way she had imagined. He simply stood there in silence for a long moment, then stepped aside and motioned for her to come into the office. Charlotte hesitated for a second, then crossed the threshold, hearing the door close behind her and knowing there was no way back now. The office was quiet. Richard Stone was gone, leaving only the two of them facing each other under the muted glow of a desk lamp. Sal walked to the window overlooking the Chicago night, his back to her, and his voice filled the stillness as he asked whether she had ever hated someone so much that she wanted them dead. The question stunned Charlotte, because she hadn't expected this. Instead of being interrogated about what she had heard, she stayed silent for a long moment, weighing whether she should tell the truth, then decided that if he had shown her a piece of his darkness, perhaps she could share hers as well. She said yes, that she had once hated someone so deeply she prayed every night for him to die. Sal turned back toward her, his eyes no longer cold but holding something else, as if he were waiting for her to continue. Charlotte took a deep breath and began to tell him about Frank, about meeting him when she was 19 and newly out of the foster system, about how gentle and attentive he had seemed at first, making her believe she had finally found someone to rely on. She told him about the first night he hit her, because she came home 5 minutes late, about how he apologized and cried and promised it would never happen again, and how foolishly she believed him. She spoke of 8 years in hell, of beatings that grew more brutal over time, of lying to doctors and saying she had fallen downstairs or hit her head on a door, of nights spent on a cold floor with broken bones, wondering why she was still alive. She lifted her shirt to show Sal the scar nearly 10 centimeters long on her left ribs, a memory from the final night when Frank kicked her until something snapped and she thought she was going to die. Sal looked at the scar, his eyes darkening, his jaw tightening, and Charlotte could see rage simmering beneath his controlled exterior. When she finished, he was silent for a long while. Then he began to speak about his mother, about Maria, the woman who gave birth to him and raised him alone without any help. He told her that his mother had once worked as a waitress in one of Don Carmine Benedetti's restaurants when she was barely 20, beautiful and naive like a flower untouched by the world's cruelty. Don Carmine noticed her, courted her with sweet promises, and when she became pregnant, he discarded her like something old and useless. Sal said his mother worked 3 jobs at once to raise him: mornings as a waitress, afternoons cleaning offices, nights at a laundromat, barely sleeping for 18 years, just to make sure he had food and could go to school. His voice grew lower as he described the day she died, collapsing in the kitchen of their miserable Southside apartment from exhaustion. And when Sal got home, she was already cold on the floor, her hands still rough and calloused from years of labor. He was 18 when he lost her, and he swore at her grave that he would become strong enough that no one could ever hurt him again, and that he would make Don Carmine pay for every tear his mother had shed. Charlotte stood there in silence as Sal finished, tears running down her face without her noticing, and she realized they were more alike than she had ever imagined. They were both broken souls, both carrying wounds that time couldn't heal, and perhaps that was why they could see each other through the armor they had built to survive. That night they didn't say much more. They simply stood there together in silence, but something had shifted between them. An invisible thread had been tied, and Charlotte knew that from that moment on, she would never be able to look at Salvatore Benedetti the same way again. After that night, everything between Charlotte and Sal began to change in subtle ways, not through grand words or dramatic gestures, but through small details she had to pay close attention to in order to notice. Whenever Charlotte became so busy with work that she forgot to eat, when she returned to her desk, there would always be a meal waiting for her. No note, no explanation, just hot food placed in pristine white porcelain containers from the restaurant kitchen. She knew it was Sal, even though he never admitted it, just as she knew he was the one who ordered someone to adjust the air conditioning in her work area after he saw her shivering one winter night. The car that took her home every night was another change she never asked for. Bruno or one of Sal's men would always be waiting at the back door when her shift ended to make sure she arrived safely at the apartment in Pilsen. At first, Charlotte wanted to refuse all of this, because she didn't want to feel like she owed anyone. But every time she opened her mouth to protest, she remembered the look in Sal's eyes the night they shared their pain, and she understood that this was the only way he knew how to show care. Late-night conversations between them became an unnamed habit. After the restaurant closed and everyone had left, Charlotte would knock on Sal's office door under the excuse of work reports, and they would end up talking until 2 or 3 in the morning about everything under the sun. It was during those nights that Charlotte discovered a completely different Salvatore Benedetti from the cold Mafia boss the outside world believed him to be. He had a vast bookshelf in his office filled with classic works she had never imagined an underworld figure would read, from Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky to Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, from ancient Greek philosophy to 19th century Russian literature. Sal told her that although his mother was poor, she always brought books home for him from the public library, believing that knowledge was the only thing no one could ever take away, and he had kept the habit of reading ever since. They debated the meaning of justice in an unjust world, whether people could truly change or if their nature was fixed from birth. Philosophical questions Charlotte had never had the chance to discuss with anyone throughout her hard life. She discovered that she liked talking to Sal, liked the way he listened to her thoughts with a seriousness no one had ever given her, liked how he challenged her ideas and forced her to see things from new angles. And perhaps most dangerously of all, she realized her heart was beginning to stir every time she saw him, even though she knew it was a path she shouldn't walk. But in the underworld, nothing stayed secret for long, and their late nights together in the office didn't escape the watchful eyes of those who climbed higher by reporting everything to those in power. Rumors about the special relationship between the boss and the floor manager spread through the organization like fire across dry grass, from whispers in the kitchen to loaded looks whenever Charlotte passed by. Patty Rossi, her former co-worker from the South Side bar, happened to run into one of the Benedetti's employees and heard these rumors. She didn't miss the opportunity, and within just a few days, the information reached Raymond Vega, the rival Mafia boss controlling Gary in Indiana, who had long been seeking to expand his territory into Chicago. Vega was Sal's sworn enemy of many years, an underground war between their organizations smoldering for over a decade with bloody executions that never reached the news. When he heard about the special woman Salvatore Benedetti was protecting, Vega immediately realized this could be the only weakness he could exploit. He ordered his men to begin investigating Charlotte Monroe, her past, her family, anything that could be turned into a weapon against Sal. And when Vega's people dug deep into the Monroe family history, they uncovered a secret that even Charlotte herself didn't know, a secret capable of destroying everything she and Sal were building. Meanwhile, Charlotte and Sal continued their late-night conversations, completely unaware that the darkness was tightening around them and that the coming storm would be more devastating than anything they could imagine. Raymond Vega sat in his office in Gary, Indiana, staring at the stack of files his men had brought back after 2 weeks of investigating Charlotte Monroe, unable to believe his own luck. James Monroe, the father of the woman Salvatore Benedetti was growing dangerously attached to, turned out not to be an ordinary nobody, as Vega had first assumed, but a former accountant for the Benedetti Empire 15 years earlier. The records showed that James Monroe had been a gifted financial mind hired by Don Carmine Benedetti to manage the organization's money flow, a man with full access to every ledger who knew exactly where every dollar came from and where it went within that vast criminal empire. Then something had changed, perhaps a sudden awakening of conscience, or perhaps fear when he realized how deeply he had sunk into a swamp of crime, and James Monroe had contacted the FBI with the intention of becoming a protected witness in exchange for his family's safety. Of course, Don Carmine learned of that betrayal before it could be carried out, and he ordered James Monroe dealt with decisively. Vega read and reread the report on the murder from 15 years ago, describing how James Monroe was shot dead in front of his 12-year-old daughter in a dark alley while walking home from work, and he laughed out loud as he grasped the gift fate had placed in his hands. The woman Salvatore Benedetti was protecting and caring for was the daughter of the man his own father had ordered killed, and this delicious coincidence was the perfect weapon to destroy his enemy from the inside. That same night, Charlotte finished her shift later than usual because of a large private event and had to stay until midnight to supervise. Bruno was supposed to drive her home, but Sal had called him away to handle an urgent matter and promised he would be back within 20 minutes. Yet those 20 minutes were all Vega's men needed. Charlotte had just stepped out the restaurant's back door when a black van screeched to a stop in front of her. 2 large men jumped out and pulled a black hood over her head before she could scream. She struggled, but they were too strong, lifting her like a doll and throwing her into the back of the vehicle. everything happening so fast that no one inside the restaurant or on the street noticed in time. When Charlotte came to, she found herself tied to a wooden chair inside an abandoned warehouse in South Chicago, the stench of mold and machine oil filling her lungs, and sitting across from her was a man she had never seen before. Raymond Vega was about 45 years old, his salt and pepper hair slicked back, and his gray eyes cold as stone, seated opposite her with one leg crossed over the other, and a smug smile on his lips. He introduced himself and asked if she knew why she was there, and when she shook her head with terror in her eyes, he sneered and said she was there because she needed to learn the truth about the man she was giving her heart to. Vega began to tell Charlotte about James Monroe, about her father's work for the Benedetti organization, about his plan to testify for the FBI, and about the execution order signed by Don Carmine Benedetti. He relayed every detail slowly and cruelly, savoring the way Charlotte's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to raw agony as the horrific truth settled in. He said the Benedetti family had taken her father when she was only 12, had driven her mother, Linda, into despair and alcoholism, had pushed Charlotte into the foster system, and had indirectly led her into 8 years of hell with Frank Hollis. He asked whether she knew who had pulled the trigger that ended her father's life, and when she looked at him with tears filling her eyes, he replied that it was a gift he would give her later. For now she only needed to understand that the man she was developing feelings for belonged to the family that had killed her father. Charlotte felt the world collapse beneath her feet. Every memory of Sal from their late-night conversations, the way he looked at her with a tenderness she had believed was real, the quiet acts of care she had begun to cherish, all shattering into countless pieces, as she realized the man she had opened her heart to was the heir of the people who had destroyed her life. She didn't know whether Sal knew about her father's past, didn't know whether all his concern had been some twisted game meant to further torment her family, and that uncertainty hurt even more than the truth itself. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't cry out. She just sat there in silence with a broken heart, wondering whether fate was mocking her, or whether this was the punishment she deserved for daring to trust a monster. Bruno returned to Benedetti's exactly 20 minutes later as promised. But when he reached the back door, Charlotte was gone without a trace, leaving behind only her handbag, scattered on the ground with its contents spilled everywhere. Bruno called Sal immediately, and within 10 minutes the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago was on site, his deep black eyes burning with a fire Tony Caruso had never seen in 20 years of loyal service. Sal picked up Charlotte's bag, his fingers tightening around it until his knuckles went white, and when he looked up at those around him, everyone instinctively stepped back, because what they saw in his eyes was no longer the familiar cold detachment, but the pure rage of a monster just awakened. Sal ordered all his people across Chicago to find any information on who had taken Charlotte and where she had been brought, and when a low-level soldier hesitated and asked whether they should wait until morning, Sal stepped in front of him, grabbed him by the collar, and lifted him off the ground. In a voice so low it was almost a growl, he said that if she wasn't found within 1 hour, he would personally kill them one by one until someone brought him an answer. No one dared breathe after that threat, and everyone scattered to carry out the order. Within 45 minutes, Sal's men captured one of those involved in the kidnapping, found celebrating with drinks at a bar near the docks, and dragged him back to a Benedetti warehouse for interrogation. Sal entered the room where the man was tied to a chair, removed his expensive suit jacket, rolled his shirt sleeves up to his elbows, and picked up a pair of pliers from the tool table without saying a word. Tony stood in the corner watching what followed and had to turn away more than once, despite having seen more violence than he could count in his life, because what Sal did to that man went far beyond anything he had ever witnessed. Sal didn't shout or lose control. He tortured the man silently and methodically with the cold precision of a surgeon, and it was that calm that was the most terrifying thing of all. The man confessed everything in under 15 minutes, from Raymond Vega being behind the kidnapping to the location of the abandoned warehouse in South Chicago, where Charlotte was being held. Sal ordered Bruno to assemble 15 armed men, and they headed to South Chicago immediately, without delay and without a detailed plan, because with every passing minute anything could happen to Charlotte. The warehouse sat in an abandoned industrial zone of crumbling buildings and empty streets, perfect for underground activity that no one wanted discovered. Vega's men were guarding the outside, but they never expected Sal to arrive so quickly, and in such numbers, and the firefight erupted the moment the first SUV stopped. What followed was a slaughter. Sal didn't take cover behind vehicles or wait for his men to clear the way like a typical boss would. He drew his pistol and walked straight toward the warehouse door as if bullets couldn't touch him. He dropped the first man, blocking his path with a single shot to the forehead. The second and third fell before they could even aim, and Sal kept moving forward without blinking. Tony ran behind him, trying to protect the boss, but Sal seemed to need no cover at all, moving through gunfire with the instincts of a man who had lived his entire life in violence, and when his gun ran dry, he picked up an enemy weapon and kept fighting. 7 men died by Sal's hand before he kicked open the door to the room where Charlotte was being held. 7 lives taken in less than 10 minutes, and he didn't hesitate for a single second. Charlotte looked up when the door burst open and saw Sal standing in the doorway. But the man before her was no longer the man who had read Dostoevsky to her during quiet late nights. He stood there with blood splattered across his white shirt, his face, his hands, his black eyes wild and empty at the same time. The eyes of a man who had just killed and was ready to kill again if needed. He crossed the room, cut the ropes binding her with a dagger, and pulled her into his arms without a word. But Charlotte stood rigid in his embrace like a statue. She didn't push him away, yet she didn't return it either. She simply stood there with a heart shattered by what Vega had told her, and with the image of Sal covered in blood seared into her mind, unable to tell whether the man holding her was a saving angel or the very devil who had destroyed her life 15 years ago. Charlotte was brought safely back to her apartment in Pilsen, close to 4 in the morning, but she didn't say a single word to Sal during the entire drive. She simply sat in the car, staring straight ahead, while her mind sank into a chaos of thoughts she couldn't untangle. When the car stopped in front of the building, she opened the door and stepped out without looking back. And when Sal called her name, she paused for a second, and then kept walking, as if she hadn't heard him at all. She knew she was being cruel to the man who had just risked his life to save hers, but she couldn't face him while Vega's words about her father were still echoing in her head. Lucy was waiting at the door with a pale face twisted with fear. She hadn't slept all night after receiving Tony's call, saying Charlotte was in trouble, but would be coming home soon. Charlotte hugged her sister tightly and lied that everything was fine, that it had only been a small misunderstanding and there was nothing to worry about, but Lucy was smart enough to see that her sister was hiding something terrible. In the days that followed, Charlotte became a ghost in her own apartment. She called the restaurant and asked for an indefinite leave, citing personal reasons. She didn't eat, didn't sleep, and spent most of her time sitting by the window staring out at the street with empty eyes. Her thoughts spun endlessly with questions she had no answers to. Whether Sal had known about her father's past from the beginning, whether all his care and protection had been some twisted game meant to continue tormenting her family, whether he had secretly laughed every time she naively opened her heart and shared her pain with the enemy. She replayed the night they told each other their pasts, remembered the pain in Sal's eyes when he spoke about Maria, and wondered if it had all been an act by a man long practiced in manipulation. The uncertainty was more brutal than the truth itself, gnawing at her mind day after day like a parasite eating her from the inside. And there were moments when she thought about waking Lucy, packing their things, and disappearing from Chicago forever, just as she had done 8 months earlier. But then she thought of Lucy thriving at her new school, of the future her sister deserved, and she couldn't bring herself to take that away just to run from her own pain. While Charlotte was sinking into despair, Sal was fighting his own private war. He had learned everything from the confession of Vega's man he tortured, about James Monroe, about the connection to his own father. And the truth struck his heart like a blade. He hadn't known about Charlotte's past until that night. He had loved her for who she was and not for any scheme. But he understood she had no reason to trust him, and he couldn't blame her for that. After many sleepless nights, Sal finally made a decision he had avoided for months. He drove to Northwestern Memorial Hospital to see Don Carmine Benedetti. The old man lay in the hospital bed, tangled in tubes, the body that had once radiated power now reduced to skin and bone, waiting for death to knock. When Don Carmine opened his eyes and saw Sal standing at the foot of the bed, a flicker of light crossed his clouded gaze as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Sal asked him directly, without detours, about James Monroe and the execution order 15 years earlier, and Don Carmine didn't deny it. The old man nodded slowly and confessed in a hoarse, disease-ravaged voice that yes, he had ordered James Monroe killed because he planned to betray the organization and testify for the FBI, that it was the rule of that world and he had no other choice. Then he fell silent for a long moment, before continuing in a trembling voice that he had been wrong. Not about James Monroe, but about Maria, about the son he had abandoned for 36 years. out of fear for his reputation and position. He said he had watched Maria waste away from exhaustion while he lived in luxury and pretended she didn't exist. He had watched Sal grow up in poverty and fight to survive on his own while he had possessed the power to give his son a far better life. Tears rolled down the old man's wrinkled face as he said he didn't deserve forgiveness for what he had done to Maria and to Sal. He knew that, and he didn't dare ask for mercy. He hadn't earned. But then he looked straight into Sal's eyes and said in a voice broken with emotion that no matter how terrible he was, his son still deserved happiness, that Sal had endured enough suffering and he shouldn't let the sins of this old man continue to destroy his future. Sal stood there watching his father cry on the hospital bed, the man who had once been the most powerful boss in Chicago, now nothing more than a dying old man begging redemption for a corrupted soul, and he didn't know what he was supposed to feel in that moment. 3 days after the meeting with Don Carmine at the hospital, Sal appeared at the door of Charlotte's apartment in Pilsen in the late afternoon, when the last sunlight of the day was turning the old rooftops gold. He stood there alone, without Tony or Bruno, without the aura of a powerful boss, just a tired man with deep shadows under his eyes and rumpled clothes, as if he hadn't slept in many nights. Charlotte opened the door and stood there looking at him without saying a word. She had imagined this moment many times over the past few days, but now that it was real, she didn't know how to react. Sal asked if he could come in to talk, and after a moment of hesitation, Charlotte stepped aside to let him pass. They sat facing each other in the small living room. Lucy was at school, and the apartment was so quiet they could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Sal began to speak, not in his familiar cold tone, but in the low, weary voice of a man who had carried a burden for too long and had finally decided to set it down. He told Charlotte that he hadn't known about James Monroe, or the connection between their fathers, until the night he tortured Vega's man to find where she was being held, that when he heard the truth from an enemy's mouth, he had been as shocked as she was. He said that if he had known earlier, he would have told her from the beginning instead of letting her hear it from someone like Vega, and he apologized that she had endured that pain alone in a dark warehouse. Charlotte listened in silence, her gray-blue eyes never leaving Sal's face, as if she were searching for any sign of deception in his words. Sal went on to admit that his father was a murderer, that Don Carmine Benedetti had ordered the deaths of countless people throughout his career, and that James Monroe was only one of them. He also admitted that he himself wasn't innocent, that he had killed 7 men in a single night to save her, and that it wasn't the first time blood had been on his hands, that he was a monster in the literal sense of the word, and had no right to ask her to see him differently. Then Sal looked straight into Charlotte's eyes and said in a voice that trembled unusually that he couldn't change the past, no matter how much he wanted to, that what had happened would always be an unerasable scar, but he could choose the future, and he chose her. He said he didn't know when she had become the most important person in his life. Maybe from the first night, when she was the only one who didn't bow her head before him, maybe when she returned the $1,000 bill and said she didn't accept pity money, or maybe the night they shared their pain in the office, and he saw his own soul reflected in her eyes. He didn't beg for her forgiveness because he knew there were things that couldn't be forgiven. He only wanted her to know the truth and to let her decide her own path. When he finished speaking, Sal stood up and left without waiting for an answer, understanding that Charlotte needed time and that he would give her all the time she needed, even if it meant losing her forever. Charlotte sat alone in the silent apartment for hours after Sal left, her mind spinning with everything he had said, unsure what to believe. The following days passed in stir turmoil as she thought of her father, remembered afternoons when they sat on the front steps and he taught her about life through simple stories. She remembered him saying that holding on to hatred was like drinking poison and waiting for the enemy to die, that forgiveness wasn't forgetting or excusing what had happened, but freeing oneself from the prison of the past. A week later, Charlotte received word that Don Carmine Benedetti had died at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and with that news came an envelope from attorney Richard Stone, containing a handwritten letter and a check for $1 million. The letter was Don Carmine's apology to the Monroe family for what he had done 15 years earlier, the trembling words of a dying old man trying to atone before meeting God. Charlotte read the letter once, then tore it into small pieces and threw it in the trash. She didn't need an apology from the man who had taken her father, and she didn't want to keep anything that reminded her of him, but she kept the $1 million check, not for herself, but to establish a fund to support orphans and abused women, to turn money born from darkness into light for people drowning in pain as she once had. And in the moment she made that decision, Charlotte realized she was ready to move forward, even if the road ahead was still filled with uncertainty. Charlotte sought Sal out one evening, 2 weeks after Don Carmine's funeral. Standing outside the door of his penthouse in the Gold Coast, with her heart pounding and her hands trembling, yet knowing this was the right decision. When Sal opened the door and saw her standing there, his dark eyes widened in surprise, before softening with something like hope that he had been trying to suppress for weeks. She stepped into the apartment, and they stood facing each other in silence for a long moment, neither knowing what to say first, until Charlotte finally spoke and said that she didn't know whether she could ever fully forgive the past. She didn't know whether wounds from 15 years ago would ever truly heal, but she did know that she didn't want to let hatred decide her future anymore. She said she had thought deeply and realized that Sal wasn't his father, just as she wasn't her mother, and that they shouldn't have to pay for the sins of those who came before them. Sal listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he were trying to memorize every detail in case this was the last time he would ever see her. When Charlotte finished speaking, he didn't rush to embrace her or offer sweet promises. Instead, he walked to the bookshelf and took out an old volume with a worn brown leather cover softened by time. He turned back and handed the book to Charlotte, and she recognized it as an old edition of Jane Eyre, its pages yellowed and carrying the familiar scent of a book that had been loved for decades. Sal explained in a low, emotional voice that this was the only book his mother had left behind when she died, that Maria had bought it from a second-hand shop when she was young and read it hundreds of times throughout her hard life. She had told Sal that she loved the story because it was about a woman who never surrendered her dignity, no matter how cruel life became, and she hoped that one day her son would find a woman like that. Sal said he had kept this book for 18 years as his most precious keepsake, and now he wanted to give it to Charlotte not as a gift but as a proposal. He said he didn't have a diamond ring or lavish promises because he knew she didn't need those things. He only had this book and his heart, both of which had been broken but were still beating. He looked straight into her eyes and said, in a trembling voice, that he was a monster in the eyes of many, and maybe they were right, but with her he wanted to become a better man. He wanted to wake up each morning with a reason to live beyond power and money. He wanted someone to come home to, and someone to protect, not out of obligation but out of love. Charlotte stood there holding the book, tears streaming down her cheeks without bothering to wipe them away, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She nodded and said she agreed, but with one condition. She said she couldn't live the life of a mafia boss's wife. She couldn't wake up every day fearing that the FBI would knock on the door with a RICO indictment. She couldn't raise children in the shadow of the underworld. She demanded that Sal gradually withdraw from illegal activities, transition his empire into legitimate businesses, and build a life where they didn't always have to look over their shoulders to see who might be watching. Sal was silent for a long moment, and Charlotte thought she might have asked for too much, but then he nodded and said he agreed, because she deserved a better life than what he could give her in the world he was living in. The wedding took place 1 month later at St. Michael's Catholic Church in Little Italy, a small church with old brick walls and simple stained glass, where Maria had prayed every week when she was alive. There was no lavish reception or hundreds of guests like the weddings of Chicago's elite. Only Tony, Bruno, Lucy, and a handful of Sal's most loyal people, sitting on worn wooden pews to witness 2 broken souls finding each other. Charlotte wore a simple white dress that she and Lucy had chosen together from a small neighborhood shop. Not an expensive designer gown, but a dress that was beautiful and true to who she was. Lucy stood beside her as maid of honor, her eyes red and tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of happiness because at last her sister had found someone worthy after all the suffering she had endured. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife and Sal bent down to kiss Charlotte, she closed her eyes and felt something she thought she had lost the ability to feel long ago, and that was hope. Charlotte's life changed completely after the wedding. She was no longer the night shift bartender from a grim Southside bar, but now Mrs. Benedetti, the most powerful woman in Chicago's underworld. The first time she appeared beside Sal at a gathering of Midwest Mafia families, she could feel the shift in how people looked at her. Bosses who once dismissed her for her poor background now bowed their heads and addressed her with respect. There were still whispers behind her back about the bartender who had suddenly become a queen, but no one dared say anything to her face, because everyone knew that touching Salvatore Benedetti's wife was the same as signing their own death notice. Charlotte didn't let this sudden change intoxicate her or make her arrogant. Instead, she realized that if she truly wanted to help Sal transition the empire into legitimacy, then she needed to understand business and finance. She hired private tutors to teach her corporate management accounting, commercial law, and investment. And on countless late nights, she sat in the penthouse library surrounded by books and her laptop, studying until her eyes burned. Sal watched his wife bury herself in learning with undisguised admiration. He had always known Charlotte was intelligent, but her determination and capacity to grow went far beyond anything he had imagined. Within a few months, Charlotte was able to sit in business meetings and offer meaningful insights instead of remaining silent, like a decorative accessory, beside her husband. Just as her new life was settling into a rhythm, one morning Tony brought news that their people had captured Frank Hollis, who had been hiding in a small town roughly 200 miles south of Chicago. He had tried to disappear after the night he confronted Sal at the bar, but the Benedetti network stretched far and wide, and no one could hide forever. Frank was brought back to Chicago and held in one of the organization's warehouses, and Sal asked Charlotte how she wanted him handled, because this was her right. Charlotte stood before the warehouse door where Frank was tied to a chair, hearing his shouting and curses from inside, and memories of every night of terror he had forced her to endure came flooding back. She remembered the sound of her ribs cracking, the taste of blood in her mouth, the moments she thought she would die under his hands, and wondered why she had ever deserved such treatment. She could order Sal's men to torture him to death. She could take a gun and end the man who had destroyed 8 years of her life, and no one would blame her for it. But Charlotte took a deep breath and turned to Sal standing beside her, and she said calmly and firmly that she didn't want to kill him. Sal didn't seem surprised. He simply asked what she wanted to do. Charlotte explained that she wanted to hand Frank over to the Chicago Police Department, along with all the evidence of his crimes. The years of domestic abuse, the stalking and threats after she escaped, everything he had done thinking he would never face consequences. She said Frank had stolen 8 years of her life, and he deserved to pay. But he should pay through justice, not through darkness. She looked at Sal and said with emotion that she didn't want to become a monster like him. She didn't want hatred to turn her into the very thing she despised most, and she believed there were punishments far worse than death. Sal nodded in agreement without objection, ordering Tony to arrange everything to deliver Frank to the police, along with a complete file of evidence their people had gathered. 1 week later, Frank Hollis was officially arrested on multiple charges of domestic violence and harassment. The case made headlines across Chicago, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison without parole. Charlotte watched the news coverage of the trial from her penthouse and felt a lightness she had never known before. Not joy at an enemy's punishment, but release, because she had finally closed the darkest chapter of her life in a way she could be proud of. But while Charlotte was building a new life, Raymond Vega in Gary was watching every development with the cold eyes of a predator. He sneered when he heard that Charlotte had refused revenge against Frank, and instead handed him to the police, seeing it as a clear sign of weakness spreading through the Benedetti empire. Vega believed Salvatore was growing soft because of love for his new wife, that the once most ruthless boss in Chicago was now letting a woman influence his decisions, and that this was the perfect moment to strike. He summoned his most trusted lieutenants and began planning a large-scale attack to wipe out the Benedetti empire once and for all, and he knew exactly where to aim to inflict the greatest damage on his enemy. Raymond Vega struck on an ordinary Tuesday morning while Charlotte was meeting with financial advisors at the penthouse, and Sal was checking operations at the main restaurant in River North. The first explosion erupted at 9:15 in the morning at the Benedetti's branch in Lincoln Park. A bomb planted inside a trash bin near the entrance detonated and completely destroyed the restaurant's facade, injuring 12 people, including 3 members of the organization. Charlotte received the news from Tony over the phone, and before she could even process it, a second call came from Francis Parker School, reporting that Lucy had been taken from the campus by a group of strangers during recess, and no one knew where the girl was. Charlotte's world collapsed in an instant. Everything she had built, every hope she had nurtured, every piece of happiness she believed she had finally found, dissolved into nothing as she thought of her 14-year-old sister in enemy hands. She ran downstairs just as Sal returned with his face taut with tension, and the moment their eyes met, they both knew Vega had declared war. Charlotte didn't cry, didn't panic the way people expected a woman to when someone she loved was kidnapped. Instead, she felt something cold and terrifying rise from deep within her, a pure fury she never knew she was capable of. She looked at Sal and said in a voice of ice that she would kill Raymond Vega with her own hands, that she would tear him apart piece by piece if he dared touch a single hair on Lucy's head. And in that moment, Sal saw in his wife's eyes the very thing he had tried to protect her from for so long, the monster that lives in every human being when they are pushed to the edge. Tony burst into the room with urgent news. The security team had reviewed all surveillance footage and discovered the source of the information leak that allowed Vega to know Lucy's schedule and the perfect moment to strike. On the screen appeared images of Patty Rossi meeting a man they identified as one of Vega's operatives at a cafe 2 weeks earlier. She had sold information about the Benedetti family to the enemy, and she was the one who had provided every detail about Lucy's school and Charlotte's daily routine. Charlotte remembered all the times Patty had looked at her strangely, back when they worked at the Southside bar. Remembered the night Frank attacked her while Patty stood by doing nothing, and she understood that this betrayal had been brewing for a long time. Patty was captured and brought before Charlotte in a dark room in the penthouse basement, kneeling on the floor with a face drained of color when she realized she had been exposed. Charlotte stood before the woman who had once been her coworker and asked in a flat voice, "Why?" a single word that carried 1,000 questions. Patty broke down crying and confessed everything, saying Vega had paid her $50,000 to provide information on the Benedetti family, more money than she could have earned in an entire lifetime of waitressing. Then Patty looked up at Charlotte with eyes full of hatred and added that it wasn't only about money. She had envied Charlotte from the first day she walked into the bar with her chin held high, despite having nothing. She hated the way Charlotte always refused things as if she were better than everyone else, and she hated it even more when Charlotte suddenly became the queen of the Benedetti empire while she was still scraping by on meager tips. Charlotte listened without speaking, and when Patty finished, she turned her gaze to the gun Bruno was holding at the ready. She could kill Patty right there and no one would blame her, but then she remembered what she had told Sal about Frank, about not wanting to become a monster. She took a deep breath and ordered Bruno to release Patty, but before the woman could sigh in relief, Charlotte stepped close and said in a voice colder than steel that she had 24 hours to disappear from Chicago and never return, and if she ever appeared within the sight of anyone in the Benedetti family, Charlotte would personally end her without hesitation. Patty nodded frantically and fled the room as if chased by ghosts, but not before she revealed everything she knew about Vega's plan, including the warehouse in Gary where Lucy was being held. Sal immediately mobilized all forces and prepared to launch a raid that night, but when he ordered Charlotte to stay behind and wait for news, she looked straight into his eyes and said in a voice that couldn't be argued with that Lucy was her sister and she was going with him, whether he agreed or not. Sal studied his wife for a long moment, saw the iron determination in those gray-blue eyes, and knew that nothing in this world could stop Charlotte from saving her sister. The Benedetti convoy tore through the night toward Gary, Indiana, as if death itself were chasing them, and inside the lead SUV, Charlotte sat beside Sal with the pistol Tony had handed her resting solidly in her grip. She had never held a gun before, but tonight she was ready to learn how to use it, if it meant saving Lucy. Vega's warehouse sat in an abandoned industrial zone on the outskirts of Gary. A 3-story red brick building with shattered windows and weeds choking the ground around it, the perfect place to hide things the light was never meant to touch. Vega's men were more numerous than expected. He had prepared for this confrontation and positioned nearly 30 gunmen around the building, but Sal had brought his most elite forces, and he had no intention of letting anyone live who stood between him and the man who had dared touch his family. The gunfight erupted the moment the vehicles stopped, shots cracking through the darkness like fireworks and muzzle flashes flickering like deadly fireflies. Bruno led Charlotte around the rear entrance, while Sal and Tony spearheaded the frontal assault, and she ran through dark corridors with her heart pounding and a single thought driving her forward: finding Lucy. She heard her sister's screams coming from a room at the far end of the second floor, and she rushed toward it without regard for danger, Bruno shooting down 2 guards at the door before Charlotte kicked it open and saw Lucy tied to a chair with her face soaked in tears. Charlotte ran to her sister, her fingers shaking as she untied the ropes, and when Lucy was finally free, they clung to each other in the dusty room, while gunfire still echoed in the distance. Lucy sobbed against Charlotte's shoulder, saying she had been so scared and thought she would never see her sister again, and Charlotte held her tighter, whispering that everything would be all right, and she would never let anyone hurt her again. Bruno escorted them down to the first floor where the fight was nearly over, Vega's men lying scattered across the ground, and the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. Charlotte handed Lucy to Bruno for protection and went to find Sal, her steps carrying her to a large room at the end of the building where she heard her husband's familiar voice. She stood outside the door and looked in, seeing Sal facing Raymond Vega with a gun aimed straight at his head. Yet Vega showed no fear, instead laughing, a wild, triumphant sound as if he knew something Sal did not. Vega spoke hoarsely from the beating he had taken, saying he had one last gift for Sal before he died. Then he pulled down his collar to reveal a black snake tattoo coiled around his neck, and asked whether Sal recognized who that tattoo belonged to. Sal didn't understand, but Charlotte did, freezing in the doorway as memories of the horrific night 15 years earlier crashed over her like a tidal wave. Remembering the silhouette of the man who shot her father dead in a dark alley, remembering the snake tattoo on his neck she had glimpsed under a streetlight before he vanished into the night. Vega laughed louder when he saw Charlotte at the door with her face drained of color, saying he was the one who pulled the trigger that ended James Monroe's life 15 years ago on Don Carmine's orders, that he had been the old man's right hand back then, before they became enemies over power, and that he still remembered the eyes of the little girl watching her father fall into a pool of blood that night. Charlotte stepped into the room like a ghost, her legs moving without her mind's command, the gun in her hand slowly lifting and pointing straight at Vega's head. She could kill him now. She could avenge her father after 15 years of not knowing who the enemy was, her finger resting on the trigger as she felt the cold metal against her skin. But then she remembered her father, remembered his gentle smile and the afternoons they sat on the front steps talking about life, remembered him teaching her that hatred only breeds more hatred, and that only love can heal the world. Tears streamed down Charlotte's face, but she didn't pull the trigger. She couldn't become a killer, even if the man before her deserved to die. She couldn't betray what her father had taught her, even as her heart shattered with pain and rage. Sal watched his wife trembling with the gun in her hand, and understood instantly what she was facing. Stepping beside her and gently lowering her weapon, he said softly that she didn't have to do this, that he would do it for her, so she wouldn't have to carry this burden for the rest of her life. Then Sal turned back to Vega, his eyes like ice, and without a second of hesitation he pulled the trigger, the bullet piercing Vega's forehead, and the man who had caused so much suffering to two families collapsed to the floor forever. Charlotte stood there staring at Vega's lifeless body, feeling no triumph or satisfaction as she had imagined she might, only a vast emptiness and a quiet relief that it was finally over. Sal wrapped her in his arms and she buried her face in his chest, crying like a child, crying for her father, crying for 15 years of pain, and crying because at last she could begin to heal. 3 years after the fateful night in Gary, Charlotte and Sal's lives had changed in ways she never would have dared to dream during her darkest days. The Benedetti Empire had completed most of its transition into legitimate business, exactly as Sal had promised on the night he proposed. The Benedetti's restaurant chain had expanded to 12 locations across the Midwest, with a reputation for authentic Italian cuisine. Real estate projects in the Gold Coast generated steady and lawful profits, and Sal had also invested in several promising technology startups in Silicon Valley. The FBI no longer monitored them the way it once had. The risk of prosecution under the RICO statute had dropped to nearly zero, and for the first time in his life Sal could sleep through the night without fearing a knock at the door after midnight. Charlotte had transformed the $1 million from Don Carmine into the foundation of the Monroe Foundation, a non-profit organization officially registered under Section 501c3 of the Federal Tax Code, dedicated to supporting survivors of domestic violence and orphan children throughout Chicago. The foundation provided safe shelter, legal assistance, vocational training, and scholarships for those trying to rebuild their lives from the ashes of the past, just as Charlotte herself once had. She devoted most of her time to this work, meeting women with frightened eyes and bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, and she saw herself reflected in every one of them. Each person she helped was a reminder that the pain she had endured wasn't meaningless, that light could grow from darkness if one had the courage to keep walking forward. Lucy had grown into a beautiful and intelligent young woman. The 14-year-old girl who once slept on a worn sofa surrounded by textbooks was now a second-year student at the prestigious Northwestern University, pursuing a pre-medical track with the dream of becoming a doctor to help those who couldn't afford care. Lucy often said her sister was her greatest inspiration, that if Charlotte could survive everything she had endured, then nothing in this world was impossible. Charlotte and Sal's greatest joy came a year after their wedding, when they welcomed their first son, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's smile. They named him James, after the grandfather he would never have the chance to meet, but Charlotte believed her father was watching over them from somewhere and smiling with pride. Even Linda, Charlotte's biological mother, had changed after witnessing her daughter's transformation. She had successfully overcome her alcoholism after many years lost to addiction, and now lived in a small, clean apartment Charlotte bought for her in Pilsen, not far from the old place where the sisters once hid. The relationship between Charlotte and her mother still carried scars that hadn't fully healed, but they were slowly rebuilding what had been lost, something Charlotte never thought possible. Each evening, after putting James into his crib and making sure he was sound asleep, Charlotte and Sal often sat together on the penthouse balcony, looking out over the Chicago skyline, glowing with lights. In those peaceful moments, Charlotte would remember the 27-year-old woman with gray-blue eyes who had seen too much death, the girl trembling in a rundown South Side bar with 3 locks on her door, and a constant fear that the past would catch up to her. She couldn't believe that woman, and the woman sitting there now, were the same person. The journey from darkness to light felt too vast to be real. Sal would often squeeze her hand in those moments. No words needed because they both understood what had been and what they had survived together. They were 2 broken souls who found each other in the dark, 2 people with pasts stained by blood and tears, who chose to build a better future rather than let hatred drown them. Redemption doesn't come from forgetting the past or pretending it never happened. It comes from accepting it, learning from it, and using one's scars to help others. Charlotte and Sal's story teaches us that no one is defined by where they began or what happened to them, but by how they choose to respond and the path they decide to walk. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, hope always exists if we are brave enough to seek it, and that true love can bloom in the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our daily videos. Don't forget to like and share this video with friends and loved ones to spread meaningful stories. We would love to know how you felt about Charlotte and Sal's journey, whether it reminded you of something in your own life, or of someone you know who faced similar hardships and overcame them with inspiration. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We read and cherish every message that comes from the heart. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye and see you again in our next video.